Most people think that if they just love hard enough, stay patient long enough, or shrink small enough, an avoidant will finally feel safe and change. But that's not how it works. If you're with someone who pulls away when things get close, who retreats when you need closeness, or who gives you breadcrumbs instead of the meal you deserve, you need to understand this. Avoidants don't fear love, they fear the cost of closeness, the emotional cost, the vulnerability, the accountability, the loss of control. But here's what they rarely admit. The right kind of safety can open the door to change. Not because you fix them, but because you create an environment where they want to step forward. The key is not making them feel less pressure. The key is making your boundaries feel like a safe container, not a prison. You can't change an avoidant by giving up your needs. You can't make them feel secure by tiptoeing around your truth. What you can do is model the very intimacy they're afraid of. You meet fear with strength. You meet distance with clarity. And you stop rewarding emotional unavailability with loyalty. Because ultimately, the avoidant doesn't learn safety when you abandon yourself. They learn it when you stay rooted in who you are while offering connection without begging for it. They change, not because you convince them, but because being with you shows them that love isn't chaos. It's not suffocation. It's not control. It's consistency. It's truth. It's someone who values themselves too much to tolerate the bare minimum. So, if you want to make an avoidant feel safe enough to change, don't dim your light. Don't walk on eggshells. Be the example of the relationship they never thought existed. And trust this, if they're ready, they'll rise to meet you. If they're not, your clarity will be what sets you free. That's not just self-respect. That's love with standards, and it's the only love worth keeping. Avoidants often get mislabeled as cold, uncaring, or even selfish. But what lies beneath that surface is a deeply rooted fear, not of love, but of what love demands. They don't run from affection because they're incapable of feeling it. They pull away when closeness begins to threaten their emotional stability. At the core, it's not love itself that intimidates them. It's the vulnerability, the exposure, and the emotional accountability that comes with it. Imagine being in a space where every moment of intimacy feels like handing over a piece of control. That's what it feels like for someone with avoidant tendencies. For many avoidants, emotional closeness triggers a response that's rooted in past pain, moments where connection led to disappointment, abandonment, or suffocation. Somewhere along the line, they learned that relying on others is unsafe, that being emotionally seen leads to being emotionally hurt. So they developed a defense distance. The more meaningful a connection feels, the more it threatens the protective shell they've spent years building. So when someone gets too close, even if it's healthy and kind, it starts to feel dangerous. And what do? They retreat, often without explanation, leaving the other person confused, hurt, and chasing for answers. This fear doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle, a delay in texts, vague responses, avoiding deeper conversations, or over-prioritizing independence. Other times, it shows up as criticism, shutting down, or picking fights to create distance. It's not intentional sabotage. It's a subconscious attempt to protect themselves from the pain they think connection will bring. They don't realize that their fear is keeping them from the very intimacy they deeply crave. It's easy to take this behavior personally. Most partners of avoidance end up feeling rejected, not enough, or responsible for fixing the situation. But it's not about the partner. It's about the avoidance internal wiring that tells them closeness is a risk, not a reward. They're not afraid of you loving them. They're afraid of what that love will cost, losing their independence, having to explain emotions they've buried, or facing expectations they don't yet feel capable of meeting. This is where things get complicated. Because the more you lean in, trying to reassure or prove you're safe, the more they pull away. Why? Because reassurance often feels like pressure. Closeness, even if offered gently, begins to feel like a demand to show up emotionally. That's terrifying to someone who's not yet equipped to be emotionally open. So they withdraw. They ghost. They become inconsistent. Not because they're bad people, but because they're overwhelmed. What most people don't realize is that avoidants don't change through pressure or pursuit. They change through experiencing connection that doesn't threaten their autonomy. They grow when they feel safe enough to come forward, not when they're chased or convinced. The starting point of that change is recognizing that what they fear isn't love, but the loss of their emotional safety. Love for them feels like surrendering too much. They believe closeness equals losing control over how they feel, and they've spent years depending on themselves to avoid exactly that. So when you see someone pull away just as things get good, it's not always a reflection of their lack of care. It's a reflection of how scary intimacy feels to someone who's spent their life avoiding it. They aren't scared of you. They're scared of what being close to you might awaken in them. Feelings they can't name, expectations they think they'll fail, pain they don't want to revisit. Understanding this doesn't mean you should tolerate unhealthy behavior, but it does mean you stop blaming yourself for their distance. Their fear isn't your fault, and their avoidance isn't a measure of your worth. It's a signal of where they still need healing. Trying to make an avoidant feel safe by sacrificing your own needs is one of the most common mistakes people make in relationships with emotionally unavailable partners. It often begins subtly. Maybe you stop asking certain questions because you know they'll pull away. You hesitate to express your feelings because you fear they'll withdraw or get defensive. You shrink parts of yourself, soften your voice, pretend not to need what you actually crave, all in an effort to keep the peace or maintain the connection. But the truth is, every time you do this, you move a little further away from yourself. You begin to lose touch with what you deserve, and the relationship becomes built on imbalance. Avoidance, whether they realize it or not, often feel safest when they have space and emotional control. The moment intimacy requires them to show up in a more emotionally available or present way, their walls come up. And instead of holding your boundary or expressing your needs clearly, you may start to adjust your behavior in hopes of not triggering their defensiveness. It feels like the only way to keep them close is to silence your own needs. But what's actually happening is that you're teaching them that your needs are flexible and that their discomfort is more important than your emotional truth. Over time, this dynamic not only erodes your self-worth, but also reinforces their avoidant tendencies. You might tell yourself you're being patient, supportive, or understanding. And while patience and understanding are valuable, they become harmful when they require you to abandon your emotional reality. You cannot build a secure connection on self-denial. The more you adapt yourself to avoid conflict or discomfort, the more permission you give the avoidant to remain distant, emotionally inconsistent, or non-committal. They don't feel the need to change because nothing in the relationship is asking them to grow. You're doing all the emotional labor while they stay in their comfort zone. What often makes this more painful is the hope that one day your loyalty and emotional sacrifice will finally convince them to change. You tell yourself that if you love them hard enough or wait long enough, they'll eventually feel secure enough to open up. But that moment rarely comes, not because they're incapable of change, but because they haven't been required to meet you halfway. Change doesn't happen in a dynamic where one person does all the bending. It happens when both people are allowed to stand fully in who they are and still choose each other from a place of respect and honesty. The irony is that the more you deny your needs, the more unstable and insecure the relationship becomes. You may start to feel resentful, emotionally starved, or even invisible. And at some point, you realize that you've worked so hard to maintain the relationship that it no longer reflects what you actually want. The connection becomes a performance, not a partnership. Your silence becomes the glue holding it all together, but at the cost of your peace and your voice. The only way to build something real with an avoidant is to show up fully as yourself, needs, emotions, boundaries, and all. If they can't handle that, then the relationship isn't sustainable anyway. When you suppress your needs, you don't make the relationship stronger. You just make yourself smaller within it. And no matter how much affection or potential there might be, a relationship that requires self-erasure to function is not love, it's survival. You don't need to be less. You need someone who can meet more. And if an avoidant is going to grow, they need to see what it looks like to love someone who refuses to disappear just to keep the connection alive. When you're dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies, the instinct is often to try harder to pull them closer. You might chase, over-explain, reassure them constantly, or even start editing your behavior to make them feel more comfortable with emotional intimacy. But these actions, although well-intentioned, often backfire. The more pressure an avoidant feels, the more likely they are to retreat. So the question becomes, how do you create safety without smothering? The answer lies in modeling the kind of intimacy they're afraid of without making it feel like a demand. Most avoidants haven't had many examples of secure, emotionally available relationships. For them, emotional closeness may be associated with being overwhelmed, trapped, or criticized. If they grew up in environments where vulnerability wasn't safe or was punished, they learn to guard their feelings as a means of self-protection. So when they start to get close to someone who is open, expressive, and emotionally grounded, it can feel unfamiliar and even threatening at first. But unfamiliar doesn't mean unwanted. Sometimes it just takes time and consistency for them to recognize that this type of connection doesn't have to equal danger or loss of control. That's why it's so important to lead by example. You don't ask them to open up by lecturing or pleading. You show them what it looks like to be honest about your feelings in a calm and non-accusatory way. You communicate your needs clearly without expecting them to read your mind. You're emotionally available, not to manipulate or convince, but because that's who you are. You bring a steady presence rather than a frantic energy, and you hold space for their responses without abandoning your own emotional truth. This balance between vulnerability and boundaries is what creates an environment where an avoidant can begin to feel safe. When they see that you can express your emotions without turning it into blame, they start to understand that intimacy doesn't have to be overwhelming. When you're consistent in how you show up, without chasing or clinging, they begin to see that love doesn't mean losing themselves. And when you share openly without trying to control their response, they get a glimpse of what real emotional maturity looks like. It's also important to remember that modeling intimacy doesn't mean over-functioning in the relationship. You're not performing for them or trying to prove your worth. You're simply being your full, emotionally honest self. And in doing so, you send a powerful message. This is what connection looks like. I can handle closeness. I can handle truth. I'm not afraid to be seen. That's something many avoidants have never encountered. Someone who isn't intimidated by emotion, who doesn't disappear at the first sign of conflict, and who respects both their own feelings and the other person's space. At first, this may trigger some resistance. Avoidance might test your boundaries, withdraw slightly, or act hot and cold. But if you remain centered, neither chasing nor withdrawing, they will either begin to regulate their fear or recognize that their old strategies no longer work in a healthy relationship. Either way, you're not bending yourself to make them feel safe. You're allowing them to experience a new kind of safety, one built on authenticity, steadiness, and mutual respect. By embodying the very intimacy they struggle with, you don't force them to change, you give them a mirror. And if they're ready to grow, they'll see that reflection not as a threat, but as an invitation. An invitation to step out of the protective patterns they've known and into a relationship that honors both closeness and freedom. Not because they're being pushed, but because they finally understand that intimacy, when it's healthy, isn't something to fear, it's something to rise into. Loyalty is often viewed as a virtue in relationships, and rightly so. But loyalty becomes dangerous when it's given to someone who continuously shows emotional unavailability. In relationships with avoidant partners, it's easy to confuse patience and devotion with unconditional support, even when the behavior you're tolerating is consistently dismissive, distant, or hurtful. You find yourself justifying the emotional gaps, rationalizing their lack of communication, and convincing yourself that if you hold on long enough, they'll come around. But here's the truth. When you reward emotional unavailability with loyalty, you reinforce the very patterns that hurt you. Avoidants often operate from a place of deep fear and self-protection. They maintain emotional distance because they're uncomfortable with vulnerability. The more someone tolerates that behavior without accountability, the more they believe it's acceptable. They don't see a need to change if every time they retreat or become cold, you respond with more understanding, more effort, or more silence about your own needs. In doing this, you teach them, often unintentionally, that connection doesn't require mutual presence, that love can exist in an emotionally one-sided space, that you'll be there no matter how absent they are. This creates a dynamic where the avoidant becomes the emotional standard setter in the relationship. They decide how close is too close, how often intimacy is allowed, and how much emotional presence they're willing to offer. Meanwhile, you're left adapting, chasing crumbs, and shrinking your expectations. You might start telling yourself that their occasional warmth is a sign of progress, that their brief moments of vulnerability are evidence that they're trying. But intimate connection isn't growth, it's confusion. And over time, confusion becomes emotional exhaustion. By staying loyal in the face of emotional unavailability, you remove the natural consequences that come from being distant. Instead of feeling the disconnection and being prompted to reflect, the avoidant feels empowered to continue as they are. Your loyalty, instead of inspiring closeness, becomes a buffer against growth. It gives the illusion of safety and commitment without requiring any real emotional investment on their part. They know you'll stay, even if they withhold. They trust your devotion more than you trust your own boundaries. What truly changes this cycle is not more love or patience, it's clarity. Clarity about what you will and will not tolerate. Clarity about what emotional availability actually looks like. And clarity about the kind of relationship you deserve. When you stop rewarding distance with loyalty, you shift the dynamic. The avoidant is no longer in control of the emotional pace. Instead, they're faced with a reality where connection must be reciprocal, consistent, and present. That's uncomfortable for them, but it's also necessary. Choosing not to be loyal to emotional unavailability doesn't mean you're cruel or impatient. It means you respect yourself enough to require real intimacy, not just fleeting moments of connection. It means you're no longer willing to be the emotional glue holding together a relationship that isn't meeting your needs. And perhaps most importantly, it means you're giving the avoidant a chance to step into accountability, not through pressure, but through the absence of a safety net that's been cushioning their behavior. If they care, they will notice the shift. If they value the connection, they will feel the discomfort of losing access to someone who once gave without question. And if they're capable of growth, that discomfort will inspire reflection, maybe even change. But none of that can happen if your loyalty remains unconditional in the face of emotional detachment. Growth requires friction. Change requires consequence. And love, real love, requires presence. You can't build a relationship on one-sided commitment and call it love. At some point, your loyalty has to return home to you. One of the most powerful truths about change, especially in emotionally avoidant people, is that it doesn't happen because someone else wants it badly enough. It happens when the individual feels inspired to grow, not forced to. You can't shame someone into becoming emotionally available. You can't beg them into vulnerability. And you certainly can't manipulate them into consistency. Real, lasting change only happens when a person sees a reason to choose a new path, when they feel that being close to you is not a loss of freedom, but a doorway to something better than what they've known. Avoidants are often ruled by a need to protect themselves. Emotional connection can feel threatening, as it often brings with it expectations, responsibility, and emotional exposure. They have spent so long relying on themselves and controlling their environment that letting someone in feels like a risk they don't know how to manage. The moment they feel pressure to open up, their natural instinct is to retreat or shut down, not necessarily because they don't care, but because they're overwhelmed by what closeness seems to demand. That's why traditional approaches, chasing, convincing, explaining, tend to push them even further away. Those strategies trigger their defenses rather than disarming them. But inspiration works differently than pressure. When you remain grounded in your emotional truth, clear about your needs, consistent in your values, and unwilling to abandon yourself for connection, you become someone who represents safety, not threat. You show that love doesn't have to mean chaos or suffocation. It can be steady, honest, and expansive. And even if the avoidant doesn't say it out loud, they notice the difference. They sense the emotional maturity. They see the calm in your communication, the depth in your boundaries, and the strength in your self-respect. That's what creates a shift, not your pursuit, but your presence. There's something profoundly attractive about someone who knows who they are and isn't trying to control anyone else. It's disarming. It's unfamiliar to someone who has spent a lifetime dodging emotional responsibility. And in that unfamiliarity, they're given the rare opportunity to choose something better, not because they feel guilt-tripped, but because they realize they're losing something real if they don't show up. Inspiration isn't about impressing them or trying to be the perfect partner. It's about being authentic, clear, and emotionally available, not as a strategy, but as a standard. You're not trying to get them to meet you. You're letting them see what it looks like to live and love with intention. When they feel safe, not because you've overfunctioned, but because you've shown what healthy connection looks like, they're given a real choice. They can either step into growth and meet you there or stay stuck in their old pattern. But now, the outcome is no longer in your hands, and that's a good thing. You've stopped trying to control their response. You're no longer basing your self-worth on their ability to show up. You've done your part by being steady, by being clear, and by refusing to participate in dysfunction just to keep someone around. Avoidants don't change because someone cried enough, waited long enough, or bent far enough. They change when they realize that their old ways are keeping them from something deeply fulfilling. And if they don't reach that point, it's not because you didn't do enough. It's because they weren't ready. The growth has to come from within them. Your job isn't to carry them to emotional maturity. Your job is to hold space for the kind of relationship that honors both people and to walk away from anything less, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. Because when someone is truly ready to change, they'll do it not to keep you, but because they finally understand the value of meeting someone in the middle. Change doesn't come from pressure. It comes from clarity, consistency, and courage, especially when you're dealing with someone who fears closeness. If you're in a relationship with an avoidant, remember, your power doesn't lie in convincing them to grow. It lies in how you honor your own emotional truth. You don't build trust by tiptoeing around their fears. You build it by being someone who stands tall in love without losing yourself. Your boundaries aren't walls. They're invitations for someone to meet you in a space where connection feels safe, mutual, and emotionally present. If they rise to meet you, it's because your steadiness inspired it, not because your silence demanded it. And if they don't, you'll walk away knowing you never shrank to earn love. You can be the example of what healthy love looks like without carrying the burden of someone else's healing. That's not giving up on love. That's raising its standard. Thank you for listening to this message and taking the time to reflect on your own emotional worth. Whether you're navigating the complexities of love, healing from a difficult dynamic, or simply learning how to honor your needs more deeply, know this: your feelings are valid, your clarity is powerful, and your love is a gift, not a bargain. Keep showing up for yourself, stay rooted in truth, and never forget, being loved starts with how you love yourself. Take care, stay strong, and thank you for being here